Hey guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. Firstly, I need to apologize that there was no video on Friday. That was just because I underestimated how long it was going to take me to research the topic that we are going to be discussing in today's video. Also, I do just need to say in advance that there are a million people at my house right now, so if there is a little bit of background noise throughout this video, I do apologize. However, I'm quite hopeful that they're just going to stay outside and there won't be much noise going on in the background of today's video. But anyways, with that all out of the way, let's get right into today's case. The topic that we are going to be discussing in today's video is the Texarkana Moonlight murders. This was a series of murders that took place in 1946 by what was dubbed the Phantom Killer in Texarkana in the springtime, who stalked the town and preyed on young couples. This all started on February 22nd, 1946, when a young couple consisting of Jimmy Hollis, who was 25 years old, and Mary Jean Levy, who was 19 years old, had gone on a date to the movies. Now, the movie had ended, the couple had successfully watched the movie, they got into Jimmy's car, and that is when they headed towards a Lover Lane type area. They parked Jimmy's vehicle at this Lover's Lane type area, and they'd only been parked there for around 10 minutes when a masked man approached the vehicle with a flashlight and a pistol. Now, I'm not really sure, but the window must have been open at this time, and the man in the mask was on Jimmy's side of the vehicle, shining the flashlight in Jimmy's face. He then said to Jimmy something along the lines of, "I don't want to kill you, so just do as I say." The man had directed Jimmy to get out of the vehicle, and once Jimmy was out of the vehicle, he then, for whatever reason, told Jimmy to take off his pants. Once Jimmy's pants were removed, they were down at his ankles. That is when the man hit Jimmy over the head twice with the pistol. He had hit Jimmy over the head so hard that Jimmy's skull was completely cracked, and when Mary had heard this, she had thought the man had shot Jimmy because the sound of him whacking Jimmy in the head with the pistol was so loud. He then proceeded to rob Mary and had attempted to sexually assault her. Mary had told this man that she didn't have any money, and this seemed to have angered the man because he then whacked Mary to the ground. Once Mary had hit the ground, he waited for her to kind of regain her consciousness, and then he told her to stand up, and once she was on her 2 feet, he then told her to run. But Mary was wearing high heels, and the attacker quickly caught up. However, during this time at some point, Jimmy actually regained consciousness despite the fact that his skull was completely cracked, and he managed to get up on his 2 feet and walk a ways down the road where he was able to flag down a car that was driving by, and he then brought that car to where the attack was taking place, and once the headlights of that vehicle were seen by Mary and the attacker, this completely scared the attacker off and he took off running. Once this vehicle had approached where the attack was taking place, luckily both Mary and Jimmy were rushed to the hospital where they were able to receive medical attention. Jimmy had remained in the hospital for a total of 14 days just getting his wounds looking after, but luckily both Mary and Jimmy did end up surviving this attack, which honestly is absolutely amazing considering how violently Jimmy was attacked by this man. Texarkana at this time was not said to be a very safe place. There was a lot of crime. The crime rate in that area was particularly high, and so because of that, the residents of Texarkana were not too shaken up by this incident. On top of that, police believed, despite what Jimmy and Mary were saying, that they knew who their attacker was, and for whatever reason they were trying to cover this entire thing up. I'm sure at one point they probably thought maybe Jimmy had attacked Mary and then Mary had fought back or something along those lines, so they just weren't too concerned. On top of that, Mary and Jimmy both could not agree on their description of what this man looked like, which I think definitely played a role in why the police were not taking this as seriously. Again, Mary had said that the man had on a white mask, especially when he approached the car, and he had eye holes and a mouth hole cut into this mask or bag or whatever it was that was over his head. Jimmy said that he could not recall if the man was wearing a mask or not. However, I don't think that that is too serious because, again, Jimmy had a flashlight shined in his face the entire time that the face-to-face interaction was taking place. And on top of that, Jimmy had been violently attacked, cracking his skull, which definitely would affect somebody's memory of that specific incident. Both Mary and Jimmy agreed that their attacker was about 6 feet tall, where Mary said that the man who had attacked them was a light-skinned black man, and Jimmy had said that it was an extremely tanned white man. So that kind of differs in their description as well. And then 1 month after this attack had taken place, that is when the second attack had occurred. In the morning hours of March 24th, that is when 2 bodies were found. These were the bodies of Richard L. Griffin, who was 29 years old, and Polly Ann Moore, who was 17. These 2 bodies were discovered at a completely separate Lover's Lane type area, and they were discovered around 8:30 to 9 a.m. The person who had discovered these 2 bodies thought that this was an extremely strange scene, not because there was 2 deceased people sitting in a vehicle, but because he thought at first that these people were sleeping in very strange positions. However, when he got closer to the vehicle, that is when he discovered that both of these people were deceased. Police were immediately called to the scene, and that is when they found that both Richard and Polly had been shot in the back of the head. Again, this scene was an in particularly strange one. Richard was discovered in between the front seats of the vehicle, on the ground on his knees with his face or his head in his hands. When police had found Richard, his pockets had been turned inside out, which suggested to them that the attacker was trying to rob him. Polly's body had been discovered in the back seat of the vehicle face down, but there was also a blanket found at the scene which suggested to police that Polly had at one point been outside of the vehicle, and that is where she had been murdered on top of this blanket, and then she was put back in the car in the back seat again, face down. The night before the bodies were discovered, the couple had been out for dinner with Richard's sister, and they had left that dinner around 10 p.m. That leaves a 9-hour gap of when exactly these murders could have taken place. It had been confirmed that both Richard and Polly had been shot with a .32 caliber, and something that is kind of confusing that got mixed up in this case was that there was some kind of confusion with the funeral home, and they came to pick the body up early, and so there was never a rape kit done on Polly's body. So it was never determined whether or not Polly was sexually assaulted. And in such huge cases like this where people were murdered, when such big mistakes like this are made, it just completely blows me away, because how could you be so careless when you're looking into something that is this serious? But anyways, that was what happened, so it was never determined whether or not Polly was sexually assaulted or not. Because this had taken so close to the last time where Jimmy and Mary were attacked, police started to consider that maybe the attacker was the same person in both of these cases. However, again, Mary and Jimmy survived their attack, and there wasn't that many similarities, so they weren't quite able to determine for sure that both of these attacks were related. But this is around the time when they started to suspect that they had a serial attacker on their hands. Now, the reason that I say serial attacker is because, again, Jimmy and Mary both survived, but unfortunately, Richard and Polly did not. Because 2 young couples had been attacked and now 2 people had completely lost their lives, police started to really crack down on this investigation, questioning up to 50 people about this case, but nobody had any information. They couldn't link anybody in this case. There was no concrete evidence, and because of that, the police were just left with pretty much nothing. The lack of evidence that was found at both of these crime scenes was absolutely shocking to police. It had rained on the night of the Richard and Polly murder, and so because of that, all of the footprints and anything like that that may have been left behind had been pretty much completely washed away. And again, there was just a total lack of evidence at this crime scene, and so because of that, police were kind of just going off of rumors that were spreading around by word of mouth. Now, like I already mentioned, police were starting to kind of entertain the thought that both the attack of Mary and Jimmy and the murder of Richard and Polly could be connected, the residents in the area thought that it was very unlikely that these were related at all. They thought that both of these, the murder as well as the attack, were two completely isolated incidents, and because the crime rate in that area was so high, people weren't really paying too much attention to either of these cases at this time. However, that would quickly change. 3 weeks later, on April 14th, that is when the residents of Texarkana would start to kind of connect the dots between all of these, the murders as well as the attack, and start to kind of realize that they had a very, very big problem on their hands. And this would set all of Texarkana into a state of complete terror. Again, it was April 14th when police found the bodies of two more young adults. These were the bodies of Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin. Betty had been playing a concert on her saxophone the previous evening, and she had left the place where she was playing her sax at around 1:30 a.m., leaving the hours between 1:30 to 6:30 a.m., and at any point between those two times is when this murder could have taken place. Paul's body was discovered first at 6:30 a.m. lying on the side of the road. His body had been discovered by a family who was out for a morning walk. When police arrived to the scene, they had found again Paul's body laying carelessly on the side of the road, and his cause of death was 4 gunshot wounds. One of these gunshot wounds was to his hand, one was to his nose, one was to the back of his neck, and one of these gunshot wounds was in his rib cage. Because there was a gunshot wound through Paul's hand, it is speculated, or assumed I should say, that Paul did try to defend himself, but clearly that did not work. At first, police were very concerned because Betty's body was nowhere to be found, but they did end up finding it a few hours later at around 11:30 a.m. They had found the body of Betty over 2 miles away from where Paul's body was discovered. Betty's body again was discovered 2 miles away from where Paul's body was found, and she was found in the woods. She had 2 gunshot wounds, and when they did an autopsy on her body, they were able to determine that she had been sexually assaulted. The gun that was used in these murders were a .32 caliber, which was the same gun that was used during the attack of Jimmy and Mary, as well as the murder of Richard and Polly. At first in this case, police had a lot of trouble tracking down Paul's car. However, they did end up finding it, and it was 1.5 miles away from where Paul's body had been discovered and over 3 miles away from where Betty's body has been discovered. And what that suggests to me is that maybe similarly to when Mary was being attacked and the killer had told her to run, maybe the attacker had also told Betty to run. Maybe he had forced her out of the vehicle and did the same things that he had done to Mary, and then told her, run. And luckily, I guess, Betty got away further than Mary had, but unfortunately, Betty still ended up losing her life. Something about this particular case that struck Betty's loved ones as extremely odd is that Betty's saxophone was never found. And again, she'd been playing a concert on her saxophone that night, so she would have had it on her the entire time. So where was it? Because of this last murder, people really started to connect the dots, like I already said, and realize that they were dealing with a serial killer. Because of this, the entire community of Texarkana was just absolutely petrified. So scared actually that when the men of the house would have to go away for work or for whatever reason, the women and the children would all come together and stay in what was known as Hotel Grimm, which was located in downtown Texarkana. And they would do this so that everybody was kind of together, which would kind of prevent anybody else from being attacked or murdered. Everybody pretty much armed themselves. People were going out and buying guns. They were booby-trapping their homes to make sure that nobody could get in because everybody was absolutely terrified. And at this point, no homes or anything like that had been broken into, but people were just so scared that the killer was going to get to that point that they were trying to make themselves as capable of defending themselves as absolutely possible because people were just so scared. Now, again, Texarkana at this time really didn't have the best reputation. The crime rate was quite high, and still, these murders absolutely shook everybody to their core, which just kind of shows to you how serious these murders really were. Again, there was next to zero evidence found at any of these crime scenes, and because of that, police didn't have very much to go off of in these cases. They were questioning tons of people on a daily basis revolving around these cases, and they even said that they received dozens of phone calls every single night after people started to be warned that there was a serial killer on the loose, because people were just so scared. They would hear a little sound outside of their house and they would call police because they were just absolutely petrified. And then on May 3rd, a 37-year-old farmer by the name of Virgil Stark was relaxing in his home, just kind of chilling out and listening to the radio, when all of a sudden a gun was shot through his front porch window. This gunshot ended up hitting Virgil and he fell to the ground. Virgil's wife, Kate, was in the bedroom kind of getting ready for bed when she had heard this loud noise coming from in the living room. She then went out of her bedroom to kind of see what was going on, and that is when she came across her husband laying on the floor bleeding out. When Kate had noticed what exactly this situation was, she tried to run away to call the police, but unfortunately Katie was also shot twice. This part of this case absolutely blew my mind because Katie is such a strong woman. She ended up being shot twice in the face and she lost tons of teeth because of this, but she ended up surviving both of those shots. Now, in my opinion, this must have been just absolutely pure adrenaline, but after Kate had been shot in the face twice, she then still managed to crawl herself back into the bedroom. Once she was in the bedroom, she then realized that the shooter was now trying to break into the home through the kitchen window. Once she had realized this, she then dragged herself back down the stairs from the bedroom and was able to escape out the front door. Once she got out the front door, she had enough energy to run to a nearby house. And during this entire time, you have to remember that Kate had 2 bullet wounds to her face. One of these bullets was lodged underneath her tongue, and she still had enough adrenaline to do all of this. And luckily, once she got to that nearby house, they were able to call the police for help. Kate was rushed to the hospital, and despite the 2 very severe gunshot wounds that again she had taken to her face, Kate did end up surviving, which just is absolutely amazing. I cannot believe that you can go through so much trauma and end up coming out okay. That is just amazing to me. But I do think that this kind of put more fear into the residents because, again, the killer seemed to have had a motive before. They were attacking young couples who were parked in their car in secluded areas. Now, Kate and Virgil did live in a secluded house, but they were not in a car and they were not as young as the previous couples. Now, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, so let's go back. Kate did end up surviving, which was absolutely amazing, but unfortunately Virgil did end up losing his life over this attack. Now, the residents of Texarkana were already in such a state of shock, but now it was just that much worse because people really feared that the killer was going to attack them within their homes. Because of this, the entire town of Texarkana had a curfew. They weren't allowed to go out past dark. And on top of that, several innocent people were shot during this entire time. I don't believe that any of these innocent people who had been shot were fatal, but people were thinking that, you know, these innocent people who were walking by their house or behaving oddly were the phantom killer and were going to attack them. And so because of this, several very innocent people throughout this case had been shot by other innocent people out of pure fear. After this, anywhere from 20 to 30 police officers came together at Katie and Virgil's farm, trying to gather as much evidence as possible, hoping that they would finally be able to identify and catch the person who had been terrorizing Texarkana. Something that was found at the Starks' home was bloody footprint trails. This went right over the highway from the Starks' home, but ultimately the police lost the trail at some point, and this didn't end up leading anywhere either. Now, to be completely honest with you, I'm not really sure what made police believe that the Stark attack was carried out by the same killer as all of the other murders that had taken place in Texarkana at that time. Again, Texarkana had a very high crime rate, and it seemed that the motive in the Starks attack, as well as all of the other murders, was very different. The murderer up until this point had been targeting young couples parked in cars at Lover Lane type areas. They had never broken into somebody's house, and there was just a lot of things about all of these cases that seemed to be quite different, but police still ended up chalking up the Starks murder to the Phantom Killer that had been preying on Texarkana all of this time. Police started doing absolutely everything in their power to try and catch the person who had been terrorizing Texarkana. They started dressing up as young couples and staging themselves in vehicles parked at Lover's Lane type areas. They were doing all of these absolutely crazy things to try and catch the person who was responsible for all of this. But none of this worked, and the Phantom Killer never appeared again. So now that we've covered absolutely every murder and attack that was taken out by the Phantom Killer, we are going to talk about some of the theories in this case. Now, during the entire time that the investigation was taking place, there were several people of interest, but there is really only two who held any grounds in this case, and so I don't really want to talk about the ones who they don't really seem plausible. It doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense that some of these people would be the Phantom Killer, so we're only going to focus on the two who are highly believed to possibly be responsible for these murders. The first person that we are going to look at in this case who could have possibly been responsible for these murders was a man by the name of H.B. Doobie Tennyson. Now, the main reason that H.B. was considered to be a suspect in this case is because he had confessed to these murders in a suicide note. He wrote this note and then he purposely ingested rat poison. H.B. did know Betty Booker, but the two of them weren't friends. They weren't even really acquaintances. They just played in the same band at school. Even though H.B. had confessed to the murders in his suicide note, that was not enough to seal the deal. His fingerprints didn't match any of the fingerprints that were found at the crime scenes, and on top of that, he wouldn't have really had a motive to want to commit these murders. H.B.'s family and friends and all of his loved ones believed that this was a false confession that was inspired to H.B. by reading way too many comic books. H.B. did have a solid alibi for the night that the Starks murder and attack had taken place, and he didn't really get his license until 1947, and on top of that, he didn't know allegedly how to shoot a gun, let alone have any access to one at all. The prime suspects in this case was a man named Ewell Swinney. Ewell and his wife Peggy had been arrested in June of 1946 on charges related to car theft. Peggy had been found driving around in a stolen vehicle on the night of the Griffin and Moore murder. The reason this is important is because there had been a lot of abandoned stolen vehicles around the time that the murders had been taking place. This led police to believe that the attackers stole these cars and then abandoned them after the murders were finished. After being arrested, Ewell started to kind of hint to police that car theft was not even close to the worst crime that he had committed, allegedly even asking one of the officers who had arrested him if he would be given the electric chair for the crimes that he had committed. Now, I'm not exactly sure how Ewell had become a prime suspect in this case. However, when he did become a prime suspect in this case, when Peggy was being questioned about everything that had taken place, she had allegedly asked how the police knew that Ewell was the murderer. After being told that Ewell was under investigation for all of these murders, Peggy then said that she had been present for the murders of Paul Martin and Betty Booker. She said that she was there when Ewell had carried out these murders, and that kind of lined up because police found a heel mark in the mud from a woman's shoe that was not a shoe that Betty would have been wearing on that night. On top of that, Peggy was able to take police directly to the spot where Paul's body had been found. On top of that, just to make Ewell look even more sketchy, Ewell and Peggy's loved ones did believe that Ewell was responsible for all of these murders. On top of that, Ewell owned a .32 caliber, which was the weapon that was used in all of these attacks besides the attack at the Stark home, when a completely different weapon was used for that murder. Ewell had allegedly had this .32 caliber until he had lost it in a game of craps, which sounds pretty funny, but it is actually a dice game. I had to Google that while doing research for this case. After this kind of stuff started coming out, Peggy then confessed to police that her husband was in fact the Phantom Killer, and she started to give them information that the police had already known, but that hadn't been released to the public. So unless Peggy was there, how would she have known this information? On top of that, when Ewell was being questioned, he remained completely silent, but he would later come back defending himself and saying that he had absolutely zero involvement in any of these murders. But what really locks and seals them as suspects for me is that there was a shirt found in Ewell's possession that had the word Stark stitched into it, as in Virgil and Katie Stark, the last people who were attacked by this Phantom Killer. However, Peggy then later retracted her claims, saying that her husband was not the Phantom Killer, and police didn't believe that they had enough to kind of concretely seal Ewell as a suspect. And the last bits of information that I want to leave you with today in this case is that an anonymous caller who was a woman ended up calling the families of the Phantom Killers once in 1999 and once in 2000. In these phone calls, this woman had apologized for what she had claimed her father had done, claiming that her father was the Phantom Killer and that he was responsible for these deaths. So again, she called the victims' families and profusely apologized. Now, what is interesting about this is Ewell had never had a daughter. Of course, this could have been some kind of sick prank, but it could also mean that there is some other person out there who was responsible for all of these murders and for whatever reason just stopped. Another thing that I wanted to add in here is I don't believe that Betty Booker's saxophone was ever found, which does seem to be very, very strange. But guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!